Hey, you've tuned in to Cisco Unplugged.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Cisco Unplugged. My name is Dan Klamert, and I lead the Wireless Center of Excellence here at Cisco. And today I am excited to host our 5th episode of Cisco Unplugged, which is a recurring live webcast with technical experts from Cisco to help keep you in tune with the latest, what's going on with the latest in Wi-Fi networks and connectivity. So we have a lot of great content lined up, not only today, but throughout the season. So you see here, you'll see a list of our upcoming episodes and past episodes. So if you're interested in getting notified when we go live, things along those lines, I'd encourage you to check out our YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/@get unplugged. So if you go there, you'll see all of our old content, our former content from previous episodes, I should say. And if you click subscribe, you'll be notified when we go live with new and upcoming content. You can also subscribe for future sessions and attend sessions via WebEx at cs.co/getunplugged as well. So today, I am excited. We have a great topic lined up on how client devices specifically discover 6 gigahertz access points. So we've got a couple of great speakers lined up here. I would like to introduce here. We have Alfredo Santiesteban from Denver, Colorado. Hey, Alfredo, how are you doing? Welcome to the show.
I'm doing great, Dan. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Unplugged.
Thanks. And we have Mr. Dan Davis from Nottingham, New Hampshire. Hey, Dan, how are you? Welcome.
Hello and welcome.
Thanks. All right, so before we get started here, I would like to encourage you, if you have questions, we use Slido to do that. So you can, if you're in the WebEx, you can look to the right of the panel and you'll see a Q&A panel for Slido. You can submit your questions there and we'll either address those live on the show or we have people that are inside Slido addressing those questions real time on the fly as well. If you're watching via YouTube, you should see the link down below to join the Slido, and we also had the QR code up earlier. If you join in via YouTube, click the link down below to join the Slido, and you can submit your questions there. So at this point, I think that's all for the reminders. So let's get on with the show. I'll hand it over to you, Alfredo.
All right. Thank you, Dan. So on today's Unplugged session, we're going to discuss the discovery protocols and efficiencies introduced with Wi-Fi 6E. These include reduced neighbor report, beacon size reduction, multi-BSSID, fast initial link setup, unsolicited broadcast probe response, and preferred scanning channel. So I'm going to ask our expert Dan some questions to help us get some clarity on these topics. And my first question to you, Dan, is why do we even need these changes or updates in the first place? Why can't we use the 802.11 protocols we have today? Maybe you can help us better understand this.
Yeah, great question, Alfredo. So the 6 gigahertz band or spectrum adds a lot more channels. And you can see here that we're showing those channels. In the European side, for the CEPT regulatory domain, not quite as much. It's about 500 megahertz. So it's about half of what we have in the United States. In the United States, we get the full 1.2 gigahertz. Now, it may be changing in the future in Europe. There's some decisions that need to be made by the World Regulatory Communications Conference. You expect that could increase the spectrum in Europe. It could end up being, say, 1.2 gigahertz, similar to what we have in the United States. But let me direct you back to the FCC domain here, the 1.2 gigahertz. And this is also applicable to other parts of the world that are also using 1.2 gigahertz, not just the United States. But we've got 59 20 megahertz channels. That's more channels than we've had ever in the past, with Wi-Fi, even if you consider the additional channels that we gain with 5 gigahertz. And from a perspective of a mobile device, from a smartphone or a client, having to go out and, discover all those channels, that's going to take some time. It typically takes about 6 seconds, in fact, for a client to discover all 59 channels. And, when Wi-Fi we typically deal in milliseconds, not so much seconds. So certainly some challenges with spectrum.
Yeah, I see. I did hear the FCC gave the Wi-Fi industry a gift. In fact, it was around 3 years ago today, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So almost doubling the available spectrum has certainly changed the Wi-Fi for the better, industry for the better. So I understand the spectrum, and thanks for that. But I'm still not fully grasping this. Maybe a little refresher would help.
All right, Alfredo, how about this? We'll do a little bit of a history lesson and kind of look at how things have been done in the past and, how they continue to be done today on the 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz spectrum. And what you have here is a couple different methods. On the bottom left, we've got passive scanning, and then on the right, we've got active scanning. And these different methods apply to both bands, whether it be 2.4 gigahertz or 5 gigahertz. So let's start with the passive scanning. We'll review that first. So in the passive scanning, you've got access points, and they're going to be on, a certain channel. They're all going to be on different channels typically. And then you've got a mobile device. And the mobile device is also going to be operating on a specific channel. Let's say that mobile device is on, say, channel 36 in the 5 gigahertz spectrum. And what it's going to do is it's going to listen to all these access points who are sending out beacons. The beacons are sent out pretty fast. They're sent out around 100 milliseconds. And this allows the client to figure out who's out there, who can it connect to from an AP standpoint. Now, one of the challenges from a client perspective is that there's lots of APs in a given space. In, say, an office environment, those APs are going to be operating on all different channels. So that client will do some active scanning as well. And in this case, the client's becoming a little bit more proactive. And we move over to the bottom right-hand side of the screen where it shows active scanning. So the client will actually go off channel. He'll move off his channel 36, kind of take a break from his day job. He'll move off that channel and go into what we call an off-channel dwell. And at that point, the client will start sending out probe requests on an off-channel frequency or an off-channel. And it does it in different ways. It might send out a specific request to a specific SSID, or it might send out a request to all the SSIDs. And that would be called kind of a wildcard or a null request, in which case all the AP's SSIDs respond that are on the same channel. And, it creates a bit of a broadcast storm when we do that. But it is a way for the client to discover all the different APs that are in its environment. And then, from there, the client builds a list, a candidate list, and it knows, what APs it has to connect to if it starts to roam, quickly throughout the environment. Now, these methods do pose some challenges. Speed, for one. If you can kind of imagine yourself in an office environment and you're doing maybe a Teams call or you're on a voice over Wi-Fi call, you move down the hallway, but at the end of the hallway, there's an elevator shaft, or maybe it's a building chase. It's blocking, the RF signal. And all of a sudden you turn around that corner, you've got an open hallway with 3 or 4 APs. Well, that client sometimes is challenged to figure out what channels those APs are on. And with the voice over Wi-Fi, we like to, think in terms of milliseconds. So speed can be a little bit of a challenge. And the other challenge, of course, is battery life. Moore's law somehow just did not apply to batteries. It's always been a challenge. And, device manufacturers, people like Apple and Samsung, they're doing all they can to give us the best battery life. And, as consumers, we certainly do appreciate that as well. And also, when a mobile device is connected to an AP that's got a really good signal, it doesn't do a lot of this probing. But when that mobile device starts walking away, when you move down the hall and you get down to, say, a signal level of, say, -70, that client device starts to do what we call a panic probe. And that does take a lot of battery power. So we try to prevent that as well. And the last point I want to make is on efficiency. So think about sports entertainment vertical. Maybe the Super Bowl is a good example. You've got 75,000 people in a stadium. And imagine all these people bringing a mobile device with them. And all these mobile devices now are trying to find out what APs are out there. How can they connect? Well, that's a lot of probing. And it's so much probing that what we see in that environment is the noise floor actually starts to rise. And it's pretty significant, especially in 2.4 gigahertz. It'll be, say, 20 to 25 dB increase on the noise floor. So now your signal to noise ratio is going to be lowered, and it's not the best optimized environment for Wi-Fi.
It certainly does look like we have a lot of overhead here, especially when it comes to probing. So can a 60 client still probe? How is this improved?
Well, Alfredo, they can, but they can't send out that null request anymore or that wild card request that I mentioned. They also have to wait a little while on the 6 gigahertz side. They have to wait, for the AP to advertise either a beacon, an R&R beacon, which we'll get to, or maybe a Phil's beacon, which we'll also discuss. But the client's got to give the AP a little bit of time to advertise itself before it starts to do any type of probing.
Okay, well, how about we dig in deeper? Let's introduce R&R and see how that helps us discover 6 gigahertz access points.
Okay, yeah. So reduced neighbor report, or R&R, and this is an important one. This kind of falls under the term of best practice. And what it is, it's really an out of band mechanism. And what I mean by out of band is this is an AP that has 6 gigahertz capabilities, and it's advertising that on the 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz WLANs, or beacons rather. Okay. And we know that these beacons are coming out at 100 milliseconds on both 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. So if you configure a SSID or a WLAN on your new Cisco access point, what will happen is the 2.4 gig and 5 gig beacons will include a information element within the beacon. And you can think of the information element kind of as a subfield. And what it does is it advertises to that device. Let's say it's a brand new Samsung device with 6E capabilities. It advertises to that device and says, hey, Mr. Samsung phone, just so you know, I do have 6 gigahertz capabilities. And if you would like to move over to that radio and take advantage of, say, a much wider channel, something like an 80 megahertz channel, and have increased throughput and a better user experience, then here's the channel number that you should move over to. And then the client will go ahead and move over. Now, the other thing that I want to point out is that different devices kind of behave differently. And that's something that's always been the case in Wi-Fi. Well, things haven't changed much there. We looked at an iPad as an example. And an iPad really relies on this reduced neighbor method, this out-of-band method exclusively, to understand that there is a 6 gigahertz WLAN operating on the AP. If you came into the environment with, say, 2.4 and 5 gigahertz disabled, we don't think that's typical, but if the iPad came into that environment, it would not see the AP. So it really relies on 2.4 and 5 to see these R&R messages. Now, we've got another client we tested. It's an Intel AX210. We had that running on a Lenovo, Windows 10 machine. First thing we had to do is do a Windows 10 to Windows 11 upgrade, which went pretty smoothly. But once we got to a Windows 11, we were able to test that. And with that client, we found a little bit different. It would use R&R, just like the iPad, but it would also work in an environment where the AP was just using 6 gigahertz. It did not need R&R to be able to discover and attach to that AP with the 6 gigahertz radio.
Good stuff here, Dan. So can you show us how to configure R&R?
Oh, well, Alfredo, that's a good question. In fact, I cannot. It's actually enabled automatically. Now, once we kind of get to the end of this video here, we will go ahead and take some time to show you some of the configurations on the Cisco 9800 that are applicable to these new protocols that are being introduced.
Well, what about the SSIDs? Do they need to be the same then?
No, in fact, they don't. You can create a different named SSID on the 6 gigahertz side, and that will be advertised by the R&R information element. In fact, you can create multiple SSIDs that are 6 gigahertz capable, and they are all advertised within that R&R information element.
Okay. And beacons, Dan, they have always been known to increase utilization, cutting into the airspace. In fact, as best practice, we try to keep the number of beacons and associated WLANs to a minimum, under 4 specifically.
That is very true. So as you can see here, the beacon format has changed a little bit. We've got the Wi-Fi 6E beacons, which are shown on the bottom, and you can kind of see just by looking at that it's smaller. And when you're sending out a beacon every 100 milliseconds, that's a lot of information, and that's coming from every WLAN you configure on the AP. So we try to minimize that because it really can be management overhead. It can start to increase channel utilization. So what we've done is we've taken out all the subfields within the beacon, these information elements that we don't really need to advertise anymore. And we've highlighted those in red at the top. You can see, the pre-Wi-Fi 6E beacons. So the HT capabilities and HT operation in red are good examples of fields that no longer need to be transmitted anymore. And the reason for that is because, remember, 6 gigahertz is our new superhighway. And what's different about this superhighway is, we're only allowing clients that really understand 6 gigahertz, right? So if you've got, an old flip phone that you want to attached to 6 gigahertz and it's operating at, say, Wi-Fi 4, well, it's not going to be allowed. It's a superhighway for only fast cars.
Oh, I see. Okay, so no 802.11n or 802.11c elements being advertised. More efficient beacons, that's great. But what about beacon overhead in general?
Well, again, Alfredo, yeah, thank you. Good consideration. Let's start by taking a look at multiple BSSID, as it's called. And I want to direct your attention to this Wi-Fi SSID overhead calculator that we're showing on this slide. And if you go out to Google, you can find a Wi-Fi beacon calculator. There's several of them out there. And what we've used this for and continue to use it for is to understand how much overhead am I seeing? How much channel utilization is being eaten up with just Wi-Fi beacons? Okay, let's say I've got an environment in an office and, it's 3 a.m. and my office is empty. There's no Wi-Fi clients at all. I could then look at my Wi-Fi utilization and I would just be looking at the beacons. All the APs advertising out beacons for all the WLANs that are there. And every time you add a new WLAN, it adds another beacon. And what happens is, it really starts to increase to the point where it eats into your channel utilization. Once you start getting up about 35 to 40% on the channel utilization side, that's when it starts to become a problem. And if you're seeing that with just beacon traffic and no client traffic, then you're kind of already in trouble. So we do really focus on this. We do try to minimize it. And the other thing is that I want to kind of draw your attention here to an aggregation method that we're using to try to reduce this. And it's shown here nicely. We've got a slide showing some packet captures. And, at the top, you can kind of see what we're calling the transmitted SSID. And what that does is actually it carries multiple SSIDs within one beacon. So now, instead of advertising all these beacons separately, we've kind of aggregated them into one. And you can see there's a non-transmitted BSSID1 and a non-transmitted BSSID2. These are actually additional beacons that are being aggregated or combined into a single beacon. So I guess, why do you need to advertise all these different beacons, especially considering a lot of these beacons have very identical information elements. So you're really sending a lot of duplicated information out over the precious airways. So this is a means to try to prevent and improve that.
Those are some good improvements. I'm glad they've been implemented. So let's go back a little bit. So as you were explaining R&R, I was wondering how a 6E client would discover an access point if the out-of-band R&R method was not used. So for example, I know that customers have 2.4 and 5 gigahertz enabled, but suppose for some reason I had a greenfield 6E scenario with no 2.4 or 5 gigahertz. Since R&R is dependent on legacy bands, how would my client then discover the access point?
Okay, let's take a look at that. So when we started off today, we talked about a couple different methods. We talked about the passive methods as well as, the active methods. And on the 6 gigahertz side, we do have a couple new passive methods. One of them is shown here, fast initial link setup. And the next one that we'll talk about is unsolicited broadcast probe response. So let's stick with this one first, FILS, or fast initial link setup. And what you can see here is you got a couple APs, both of them on the same channel as the client. And they're sending out beacons, which are highlighted in yellow. And these beacons are sent out around 100 milliseconds. But then you've got, this fills frame, which is new. And this is sent out, you can see, much faster. It's sent out at 20 milliseconds. So from the perspective of a client, if you can kind of think, if you were a client, a Wi-Fi client, let's say, you had to go off channel. You would only have to go off channel for that dwell time for 20 milliseconds. Okay. And within that 20 milliseconds, you're going to hear one of these APs, that are on the same channel. So it's going to make it a lot more efficient. You're not going to have to go out and start sending out, active methods. You're not going to have to send out like probe requests. That's really what we're trying to prevent here by doing this. And I also want to point out that this is the preferred method. There's a couple different passive methods that we're going to talk about. Fills is the preferred method, and it's also something that's used on 6 gigahertz exclusively. Okay, so if you've got a scenario where 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz are disabled, and again, we don't think that's going to be typical, but let's just say you did that, then in that case, the AP is going to go ahead and enable fills and use fills. But when you've got 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz working, we're going to really rely on that R&R method as a best practice for the clients to discover the APs.
I get it. So I can really see how a client can connect faster, spend less time off channel, and help keep the noise floor down by not sending out all those probes. So it even helps extend the battery life. So you mentioned a second passive method, the unsolicited broadcast probe response. Can you touch on that method as well?
Yeah, certainly. We can dissect this a little bit. So when you look at the configurations, which we'll show you on the Cisco 9800, we do include this as a passive method. So it is important to bring it up and kind of understand what it is. But I think, most importantly, I do want to say here before we dissect this a little bit that we're not seeing unsolicited broadcast probe response really being adopted by anyone as of yet. This is something that we're watching. Maybe in the future we will remove it from the GUI, remove it from a configuration. But for now, it is in there. We're watching the market. It's 6E. It's maturing. It's still new. So we will see. But let's dig into it a little bit. So if we look at the first piece of this, unsolicited, what does that mean? Well, in the past, if you thought about how active discovery worked, the client would send out a probe request. And then the AP would come back with a probe response and say, hey, I'm out here. You can connect to me if you would like to. Well, what's happening here is it's unsolicited. So the AP is not waiting for a client to send a probe request. It's just sending out these probe responses. Okay. Now, if we move to the broadcast piece of this, well, that's just what it's doing. It's not sending this probe response to a particular client. It's not responding, say, in a unicast fashion to a client that sent a probe request. Instead, it's sending these out to everybody. Okay. And, these are a little bit different than the fills, but keep in mind that they really are both set up to accomplish the same thing. The unsolicited broadcast probe response, there's a little bit more information in these probe responses. It's very similar to what you would find, say, in a beacon, minus the traffic indication map, or TIM, which is used for power management. And because of that, with the unsolicited broadcast probe response, a client can actually, go through the association process when it hears one of these. And they're also sent out at 20 milliseconds. So, coming out very fast, which gives the client the ability to just do a short off-channel dwell and then, get back to its day job on its main channel that it's operating on. And, again, it's really all to help avoid a scenario where you've got a client who is doing active scanning. But again, let me just say that we're not really seeing much of this being used yet.
I see. So as a client, I don't need to wait 100 milliseconds for a beacon. I'll hear the unsolicited broadcast probe response in 20 milliseconds, and I don't need to send a probe out to get it. So if the client needs to hear an AP in an off channel, in that case, it should hear those APs much quicker as well. So less time on the off channel dwell is great for real-time Wi-Fi applications such as Teams calls. So Dan, this has been really helpful so far. We have covered the passive methods where the client just needs to listen to the AP, but how about active methods? like we have used historically, where a client sends a probe request to understand what APs are available on different channels. Is this still available?
In fact, Alfredo, it is. Again, the client does, however, have to give the AP a chance to advertise itself. An R&R message embedded in the beacons at 100 milliseconds. If it's a unique scenario where it's 6 gigahertz only, then the client has to give the AP a chance to advertise itself. And in that case, the client's going to have to wait at least 20 milliseconds for something like a fills to be sent out. Now, when you look at like active methods from the client's perspective, how does the client do active probing instead of just listening for the passive methods like a fills? We use a preferred scanning channel for that, or what we call PSC. And the example we're showing here uses 80 megahertz channels. And, if you're in the FCC domain or in a environment where you do have, 1.2 gigahertz, maybe that's the United States, maybe it's Saudi Arabia. There's different places around the world that do have 1.2 gigahertz. And in those environments, in those regulatory domains, you're going to see Cisco set the default channel width to 80 megahertz. And in that case, what you will see is one out of every 4 channels set up to be what's called the primary channel. And the primary channel's kind of got a special responsibility. There's 4 channels bonded together. They're all 20 megahertz channels. That makes up 80 megahertz. And the one is the one that's the primary is going to be the channel that's sending out the beacons. It's also going to be the channel that you could send a probe request to as an active scanning method, and it would respond. So now what you have to think about here is, from a client's perspective, the client is only going to have a list of channels, and it's the PSC channel list that you can see on the bottom of the slide there. So it's only going to be probing on those channels. And if you've got 80 megahertz in play, which we think most customers are going to use, then there'll be around 14 PSC channels that it has to go out and actively probe. Contrast that to 5 gigahertz. On 5 gigahertz, at least in the United States, we had around 12 channels. Now, if you get into some of the other, what we call DFS channels on 5 gigahertz, it could be as many as 25. So we've kind of got a similar amount of channels here when you're using 80 megahertz as we had with the 5 gigahertz side. Now, if you decide for some reason to use, say, 40 megahertz channels in the United States where you've got 1.2 gigahertz, then in that case, things do change a little bit. If RM is aligning these 40 megahertz channels, you could have a scenario where the primary channel is no longer aligned with the PSC channel. Okay, and in that case, a client may go out and send a probe request to that particular channel, but that channel may not respond because it's not the PSC channel. In that case, you would have to have a client that discovered that channel was available through another mechanism. It might be R&R. In a 6 gigahertz only environment, it might be fills.
Okay, so what if a client wants to probe for a non-PSC channel?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me review. So the client can do that, but it's going to have to go ahead and listen first. It's going to have to listen and hear a beacon. Maybe that's an R&R type beacon from 2.4 gig or 5, or if it was operating on the 6 gigahertz side exclusively, it could be a fills beacon being sent out, which is every 20 milliseconds. And once it does discover that channel's in play, it can go ahead and send an active probe out. We're also going to see some differences between clients. As you look at all the different clients and the different drivers out there and start looking at some of these more detailed type protocol issues, you're going to see some subtle differences. It's always been a challenge in Wi-Fi, but expect more to come with 6E.
Okay. Well, would it be possible for you to show us how to configure this on a Cisco 9800 wireless LAN controller?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great idea. It might help, solidify some of the concepts we've talked about. So here's a 9800L, and you can see that we are running 17.93 up here in the top left. So relatively new software load. And if I go into configuration and then under tags and profiles, under the RF radio section, there's going to be several different profiles. I'm going to pick this one here, 6 gigahertz. And we'll take a look inside the details here and see what we can configure. AX11AX is where you're going to find these configurations. And I'm going to hover over this little information icon. It kind of calls out the R&R as the default mechanism. And that's what we're going to use in most all cases. But if you've got a scenario where you're running 6 gigahertz only, there is the broadcast probe response there. Again, that's not our most recommended setting. We're not seeing any client manufacturers use that. And then it is an OR condition. You've got the fills under there, which you would probably use if you were just using 6 gigahertz. And then we've got a broadcast probe response interval that can be anywhere from 5 to 25 milliseconds. And then also multiple BSSID profile. You can see that's listed as well. We talked about that as a way to aggregate SSIDs. And that can be configured separately too. Let's take a look at that. This is the default setup. We don't expect customers are going to really have to change this, but maybe you've got a scenario where downlink multi-user MIMO is not working well on a client, and you've got the ability there to disable that. Now, the last one is the PSC channels, which we just talked about, and it's found in the same spot under that RF profile. We'll select the 6 gigahertz band. And this time, take a look at RM, Radio Resource Management, and then Dynamic Channel Allocation, or DCA. And you can see there's the PSC enforcement. You're going to want to enable that, and that gives you the ability for the access point to set up, the PSC channels. In 80 megahertz, it would be, 40. And then there's the DCA channel list above that too. You could, if you wanted to, take out some of the channels that are PSC channels. We don't really recommend that because the clients don't get notified if you make that change. So if I were to take out, say, channel 5 in the mix here, that's a PSC channel. It's not as if the AP is going to tell the client that he no longer needs to use that. And some customers might want to do that because they want to reduce the amount of scanning that a client has to do. But not really recommended, probably not going to really help much because the client's always just going to use those same PSC channels, the 5, 21, 37 that are listed there on the bottom. Okay, so that kind of wraps up the brief 9800 6E configurations. There's not really too many. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, that's a lot easier than I thought it was. Thank you for showing us that.
Yeah, no problem. So let's wrap this up here. We want to do a little bit of an advertisement here. These are the 6E access points that Cisco is currently offering. These are all indoor access points. We do have an outdoor access point. I'm not showing it. It's the 9167. But let's take a look at the indoor lineup. We've got on the far right the 9136. This is our flagship AP. It does have an 8x8 5 gigahertz radio. Now also on the Ethernet side, a little bit unique, it does have 2 Ethernet ports. So with that, you could connect those Ethernet ports to a single switch in a lag or Ether channel bundle. You're not going to get 10 gig if you do that. You don't get the advantages of having more throughput there. But you could also, do what's called like a split uplink for improved redundancy. So you could have one Ethernet port go to switch 1. The other Ethernet port could go to switch 2. Now, in that case, you're going to want to have those switches, say, in the same stack, or maybe set up as a VPC or VSS pair. And we also do have PoE redundancy on these ports. Power is not always present on both ports. You're going to have PoE on a single port, but if that port should say fail or go away, then the other port will bring up PoE on that port almost instantaneous, and the AP will continue to operate. Looking at the other APs, the 916X series, what's unique about these is first time we've done co-development with Meraki. So the hardware platform is common, as noted. And from a software perspective, you can use different personas. So you can load in a Cisco Catalyst image if you want to connect to our on-prem product. If you want to use this AP, say for Meraki, which is more of a cloud product. It's a software as a service model. You then would load the Meraki load onto one of these particular APs. And that's kind of nice. So, if you're using on-premise today, or maybe you're using Meraki today and another company acquires you, and all of a sudden you kind of have to have a common hardware platform, something like that allows you to, switch over from one to the other. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Dan.
All right. That was great. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Alfredo. Really appreciate it. Great topic and show today. So just looking at Slido here, it looks like we did have a couple questions. They've all been answered. I did want to call everyone's attention to one question because it is very relevant to the topic today at hand. What I'm specifically want to call out is the answer of a link here with more information. So one of our architects on our Wireless Center of Excellence team, Al Dumdai, has put together a blog series here on Wi-Fi 6E, and his latest part 2 just dropped this week, and it's very applicable to today's show. So I would refer you to that answer to that question here with the link in the Slido to Al's blog with lots of great information to follow up and supplement today's topic. So just before we close here, I would like to remind everyone to take some time to complete the survey at the end here. It's a very brief survey, so we'd love to hear your feedback on the show today. And also, if you have any suggestions for future topics, we'd love to hear that as well. And as far as for future shows, again, if you want to be notified when we go live here on YouTube, go to our YouTube channel and youtube.com/@GetUnplugged and subscribe there. You'll be notified when we go live next time. If you'd like to see the upcoming sessions and subscribe or register for those via WebEx, you can do that at our link, our abbreviated link, cs.co/GetUnplugged. So that you'll be able to then be notified for upcoming episodes here, and we've got some more great shows coming. So also, if you would like to follow up with us, just as a reminder, you can always reach out to us via your local Cisco account team, and they know how to get a hold of anyone here on our team, the Wireless Center of Excellence. So with that, that puts another great episode in the books, and I would like to thank everyone for your time, and until next time, stay connected and unplugged.